and gentlemen, welcome to tonight's debate. My name is Rebecca and I'm the chairman, and Mr. Brennan is the timekeeper. The adjudicator is Mr. Baker. The topic of this debate is that the cost of COVID-19 is worse than the virus. The affirmative team seated to my right is from Brighton Secondary School. The negative team seated to my left is from Pembroke School. The speaking time for this debate is 6 minutes. A single warning bell will sound 1 minute before the speaking time, and a double bell will sound at the speaking time. A continuous bell may be rung 30 seconds after the speaking time, in which case the speaker must sit down immediately. Please switch off your mobile devices and other electronic devices. I declare this debate open and call upon the first affirmative speaker, Jasmine Greta.
Good evening, Madam. Oh, can I take my mask off? Is that okay?
Yes. Yeah. Feel free to take your mask off. Guys, you will see you may take your mask off.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, negative team, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Jazz and I am the first representative of the affirmative team. The topic for our debate tonight is that the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is worse than the virus. I and the rest of the affirmative team resolutely agree with this statement. We define cost as loss or penalty incurred, especially when gaining something, Merriam-Webster, and do not limit its definition to a monetary expense. We define COVID-19 pandemic as the worldwide spread of the COVID-19 disease, including any of its variants, from January 2019 to the present day. We define worse as more unpleasant, difficult, or severe than something else that is also bad, Cambridge Dictionary. Tonight, the affirmative team is structured as follows. I'll be presenting you with the two following points. How improper monetary management has strained our medical system, costing many citizens their physical and mental health, as well as how the safety of religions and disabled groups has been compromised over the course of this pandemic. Our second speaker, Harper, will talk about the historical economic trends on the aftermath of a pandemic and the resulting issues with job loss. Finally, Rosie, our third speaker, will rebut negative points and sum up our team's case. There has been an enormous amount of staff, equipment, and hospital space used to treat those with COVID-19. The funding for hospitals globally is severely disproportionate to the huge influx of victims needing treatment. In Australia, there has already been $2.4 billion boosted into the health system, and that barely made a dent in the tidal wave of new cases and support necessary. As COVID hospitalisations reach all-time highs, with numbers reaching well over 90,000 as of the 5th of September, taken from the European Centre of Disease Control, the lack of economic stimulation makes it nearly impossible to provide proper equipment for IC units and space for patients. In smaller hospitals, those on ventilators and in dire need of ECMO, or extracorporeal life support, have been forced to travel as beds are taken up by other COVID-19 victims already getting ECMO. To say that the virus is worse than an underfunded, understaffed, and under-equipped medical system would be false. The overexertion of our medical system additionally impacts the hundreds of people reliant on aged or disability care. An NDIS representative reported to ABC that the actions of the Sustainability Action Task Force will take immediate changes to slow the growth in participant numbers and slow growth in spend per participant. NDIS also started using independent assessments that were not up to scratch, and large groups of disabled people didn't receive the care they needed, ABC reported. This is all so that NDIS can cut fund expenditure. Under usual circumstances, people with disabilities are 2 to 4 times more likely to be injured or die in disasters. COVID-19 has heightened that risk tenfold. Marcy Roth, CEO of the World Institute of Disability, says that COVID-19 deaths attributed to congregate facilities are disabled people. Lacking of planning and funding contributes to these high numbers. The inevitable toll on this community is far greater than the virus itself. This brings me to another point. Mental health is another vital part of the world that has faced a steep cost. Many Australians develop mental disorders over the course of the pandemic due to extreme stress and long periods of isolation. In August 2020, the Better Access Initiative was expanded to provide 10 additional MBS subsidised individual psychology sessions for all Australians. Between 16th of March 2020 and the 25th of April 2021, over 15 million Medicare subsidised health services provided by GPs, psychiatrists, psychologists and other allied health workers were processed, with almost 1.7 billion in benefits paid. Nearly 4.5 million of these services were delivered via telehealth, as opposed to face-to-face, and over 515 million was paid in benefits for these telehealth services, adding to an extraordinary monetary figure to a very real problem. The quarantines have forced citizens inside, unfortunately increasing exposure to domestic violence. More than 2/3 of domestic family violence agencies surveyed reported an increase in new violent victims. In 2021, Lifeline received almost 82,000 calls, an increase of 18.4% from April 2019. Kids Helpline received almost 26,000 answerable contact attempts, 10.5% more than April 2019. Beyond Blue received a call increase of 30.7%, over 22,000 contacts. On to my final point. The cost of the pandemic only worsens when you look at the devastating amount of religious and race discrimination taking place in the name of infection prevention. Members of the Tablighi Jamaat and Islamic missionary movement have always been eyed by suspicion by Indian authorities. Since March this year, over 3,000 members of this religion subsequently spent more than 40 days in quarantine, with government authorities refusing to discharge them. Miles away, in a Pakistani province, 900,000 members of the Shia Hazaras tribe have been labelled as a carrier for the disease. Targeted by state authorities since March, at least 1,500 Hazaras returning from Iran were quarantined, whilst others, non-Hazara citizens on the same flight, were not. This discrimination phenomenon has been seen worldwide, and it is perhaps most important to acknowledge the horrific Asian hate crimes that have been committed when it was revealed that COVID's first cases were found in Wuhan, China. Asian American citizens were represented with a 70% increase in verbal harassment reported by Stop AAP. They were chased by death threats, derogatory comments, and violence simply for their race. The safety of Asian cultures and religious groups is one of the many costs this pandemic has created. Perpetuating the idea that the virus is solely to blame for the loss of life harms any positive progress that can be made towards the future. Thank you.
I call upon the first negative speaker, Joy Zhang.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is worse than the virus. We agree with the affirmative team's definition. However, we as the negative team strongly believe that this statement is false. The first speaker from the affirmative team has tried to tell you that the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is worse than the virus, as it has been highly detrimental from a mental health perspective. We, the negative team, acknowledge that some people's mental health has worsened due to the pandemic, but believe that this is not only a result of the pandemic, but also the virus. As I will be stating later again, the virus has resulted in the death of over 4.6 million people, with a total of approximately 222 million people being infected, according to Worldometer. Surely, you would agree that this immense spread of the virus largely contributes to the worsening of mental health, as people see their friends, family, and other members of the community suffering and even dying. Now, I will be opening our team's case. Today, as the negative team, we'll be expressing our side of the debate from a health perspective. As the first speaker, I will be talking to you about the virus itself, the characteristics of the virus which makes it so deadly. Our second speaker, Idika, will be concerning you with the long-term health risk and how society may recover from the virus, but people's body will not. And lastly, our third speaker, Sasha, will be rebutting and summarizing our team's case. I would like to now start off with my first point, how the virus itself is deadly and that people are dying because of the virus. According to Worldometer, since the discovery of COVID-19, approximately 4.6 million people have died from the virus. And according to Harvard Health, SARS-CoV-2, short for Severe Acute Respiratory Syndrome, coronavirus 2, is the official name for the coronavirus responsible for COVID-19. The virus primarily attacks throat and lungs and reproduces by affecting other body cells. A typical flu virus would have to reach the nucleus of a cell in order to reproduce. However, the SARS-CoV-2 virus can reproduce by only accessing parts of a cell, called ribosomes. This helps this virus to eventually merge with the cell, making a new replica of itself. When the virus gets to the lungs, that's where the bad stuff starts to happen. As the immune system is already weakened by the virus itself prior to getting to the lungs, when the virus gets to the lung, bronchioles, commonly known as the windpipe, and the alveoli, tiny air sacs at the end of the windpipe, can be inflamed with fluid and can cause difficulty in getting oxygen. A result of this could be pneumonia, which can cause symptoms such as breathing difficulties, chest pain, fatigue, muscle pain, and more. In a more severe case, it can also cause respiratory failure, and a ventilator must be used. The most severe symptom that can be caused by COVID-19 is the acute respiratory distress syndrome. This is a serious lung condition that causes low blood oxygen, making patients with this condition hard or impossible to breathe, thus can also cause failure in lungs, kidneys, and livers. We acknowledge that the severe symptoms does not apply to the whole population, as statistics from Healthline do show that 80% of people will most likely get mild syndromes. However, ladies and gentlemen, surely you can agree with me that the COVID-19 virus poses just as, and if not more, of a threat to our species than the cost of COVID-19 pandemic. Now to my second point, where I'll be discussing how contagious the coronavirus itself is and its many strains and its potential to mutate again, and the cost of the pandemic, therefore, is not as detrimental to the population. According to Yale Medicine, when no one in a completely unmitigated environment where no one is vaccinated or wearing masks, it is estimated that the original coronavirus will infect 2.5 other people. This data shows that the virus can spread extremely quickly in an exponential manner. According to the Worldometer, more than 200 million people across the world have contracted the virus. Yet, as most of you probably know, the newly discovered Delta variant is much worse and transmissible than the original strand. According to WHO, it is 2 times more contagious than the original strand due to perhaps mutation in the protein spikes, making the virus easier to bind with receptors, thus easier to reproduce. According to Reuters, there have been over 33 million infections and over 440,000 coronavirus-related deaths reported in India since the pandemic began. Yes, the cost of the pandemic is significant, But in one country, to have over 33 million affected by the virus itself is catastrophic. According to the Worldometer, in the United States, there has been over 41.2 million COVID cases and nearly 700,000 deaths from it. By contrast, for all of 2020, 38,680 people died on US roads, fewer than 5.5% of deaths by COVID. And yet we find any road traffic deaths senseless and do all we can to prevent any such as rules and regulations, fines, jail sentences. Behind every statistic of death, there is a life cost. The cost of the pandemic is therefore not worse than the virus. So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, we as the negative team strongly believe that the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is not worse than the virus. Thank you.
I'll call upon the second affirmative speaker, Harper Forsyth.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, and the adjudicator. The topic of tonight's debate is that the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is worse than the virus itself. We, the affirmative team, unequivocally believe and will prove this statement to be true. The first negative speaker has told you that the virus is deadly. This is true. We are not contesting this fact in any matter. But what we're saying is that a virus on its own does not normally do this level of damage. What is doing this level of damage is the poverty we are pushing people into and the consistent mismanagement of the virus since the beginning of the pandemic. People aren't just dying from the virus. There are many other causes connected to the virus that we're simply not looking at. And if we only look at the virus, our arguments and our ideas will become short-sighted. They have also discussed the different variants that have popped up, but we have known about this the entire way. Dr. Peter Hobbins early on predicted these variants. We have known about all the ideas of the second wave and the Delta variant since the beginning, but the only issue has been the constant mismanagement and people ignoring that. They have also mentioned that in one country, 33 million people were infected by the virus, and that fact is tragic, but it is also pertinent to mention that the virus has pushed 40 million people in Africa into extreme poverty and on the brink and risk of death. Our first speaker, Jasmine Grether, has already talked to you about the strain on the medical system that the pandemic perpetuates, as well as the cultural impact we are facing on the daily. Tonight, I will be talking to you about 2 points: the historical economic trends in the wake of a pandemic and how we are traipsing the well-worn path of economic decline in the wake of a pandemic, as well as death following job loss. Now on to my first point. When COVID-19 first started gaining global traction, many experts looked to the greatest medical holocaust in history, a term popularized by author Catherine Arnold. We are of course talking about the influenza pandemic of 1918, as a historical precedent for unforeseen disease outbreak on a global scale. Dr. Peter Hobbins, leading expert on the Spanish flu in Australia, reported to the University of Sydney in early 2020 there are some striking parallels between 1919 and 2020. A Barrow et al. Study found that in 42 countries, the flu reduced real GDP per capita by 6%. GDP is indicative of production capacity and economic growth, as reported in the Harvard Business Review. In context, the world economy contracted 1.7% in the global financial crisis of 2009,
according to the United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs. The World Bank forecast a 4.2% annual GDP shrink following COVID. Think about all the people impoverished, out of work, or worse as a result of this. Kaushik Basu, Senior Fellow at Brookings Global Economy and Development Department, has said that the poor are bearing the brunt of the impact, and this statement rings true now more than ever. The virus does not discriminate between the rich and poor, but their economic mobility in these trying times 100% will. Emerging economies have been particularly hit with rising debts, such as Zambia and Argentina. Post-pandemic, Latin America's economy contracted 7.7%. Remember, the world economy contracted 1.7% in 2009, a financial crisis that we still mention and feel today. The World Bank estimates that the pandemic forced 40 million people in Africa into extreme poverty. The second wave is particularly deadly. The Center for Monitoring the Indian Economy have found that the 7 million jobs lost in April, that the country's unemployment rate declined to 8%, over 1.5% in a single month. Youth unemployment in India is the highest it's ever been at a whopping 23.75%. This brings me to my next point and the second pandemic we are facing, joblessness. At the height of the Spanish flu pandemic, flu-related incapacitation took out 2% of the labour force, according to the Reserve Bank of Australia. Similarly, July 2021 saw Australian unemployment climb to 7.4%, according to the Australian Bureau of Statistics. These statistics do not even begin to explore the underemployment of Australians throughout the pandemic. The number of jobs climbs to appease the public, while our hours worked sink into the ground. Underemployment is when underemployment is when people are not having enough paid work, according to the Oxford English Dictionary. Unemployment simply measures joblessness. In July of 2021, Australian unemployment fell to 4.9%, allowing underemployment to climb significantly to 7.9%. There are more jobs, but not enough hours, and it is stifling our economy. And we're one of the lucky countries. 64% of households in the Philippines have a member who has suffered due to the enhanced community quarantine, according to Statista. Job loss is not only devastating on an economic scale, but a personal one. Drexel University reports that there is a 73% increase in probability of death following job loss. That is equivalent to taking 10 years off of a person's age. As a country, we have had just over 1,000 deaths attributed to COVID, and BBC reports over 1 million job losses. There is a 73% increase in the likelihood of death, staring 1 million people in the eye. The Medical Journal of Australia reports that there is a 2 to 3-fold increase in increased relative risk of death by suicide following job loss. They also project a 27% rise in Canada's suicide rate following the pandemic. CBC reports, Canada has only lost 1/5 of the jobs that we have endured. The virus isn't decreasing funds and care for the jobless. The virus isn't taking away mental health care and disability support. The virus isn't raising suicide rates. A virus doesn't do anything but spread. What is causing these global social and economic issues is the mishandling of the economy during these trying times. Thank you.
I call upon the second negative speaker, Idika Mahaja. Start? Okay.
Good evening, Madam Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic for tonight's debate is that the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is worse than the virus. We, the negative team, strongly believe that this statement is false. Our first speaker, Joy, has informed you about the effects of the virus immediately on the health of its victims and how contagious it is, and the effect of the mutants on our society is worse than the pandemic. I, as second speaker, will be rebutting and informing you of the long-term health risks to its victims even after being cured, and how the society may recover, their bodies may not. And our third speaker, Sasha, will be summing up our team's case and rebutting the affirmative. To get onto the rebuttals, the first speaker from the affirmative team has tried to tell you that the pandemic has very negatively affected the mental health of the populations. However, we do acknowledge that this is true for the large part, but they have neglected to tell you the other side of the story. According to a statistic provided by the study from University of Sydney, it also shows that 70% of the participants experienced at least one positive outcome from the pandemic in the form of stress relief or better work-life balance, while 54.2% had a more sufficient well-being due to the pandemic. The first speaker from the affirmative has also tried to tell you that the poor management of the COVID-19 virus pandemic is only because of the monetary management, or well, lack thereof, in the medical centre. This is not the case, as it is well in the name, COVID-19 virus pandemic. You can't really have a COVID-19 virus pandemic without the COVID-19 virus, can you? It is not only the monetary management that was because it was so disadvantaged because nobody was really expecting the virus. As for my third rebuttal, the second speaker has tried to tell you that the GDP of all countries has decreased. This, however, isn't the case. As countries such as our own, Australia, GDP has actually increased by 1.1%, according to ABC. And after the pandemic, we acknowledge that economically many countries have been and currently are suffering. But it is unfair to say that all are when that is not true. Now to my argument. The long-term health effects of the COVID-19, even after being cured, are far worse than the pandemic itself. As society will rebound, their bodies may not. The Australian government is actively monitoring medical research being done around the world on short and long-term health effects of the COVID-19. COVID-19 can affect a range of body systems, including those related to the lungs, heart, brain, liver, kidneys, intestines, muscles, joints, and blood vessels. That's a lot of body systems. That's almost the entire body. According to the World Health Organization, there is now viable evidence that some people experience ongoing symptoms after recovering from the acute ailments in relation to the COVID-19 virus. These symptoms can even last weeks to months after recovery from their initial illness. The most common appearance of the ongoing symptoms are those who were previously affected by more serious ailments than COVID-19. Examples being who were previously receiving treatments in hospitals. Up to 30% of seriously ill patients have reported at least one symptom, most commonly fatigue, persisting up to 6 months. However, some people who initially had mild symptoms have also reported persistent symptoms. This suggests that the virus may cause a prolonged impact on the number of body systems that it can affect, both physical and mental health. The most common ongoing symptoms include fatigue, shortness of breath, loss of or reduced sense of smell and taste, chest pain, lack of sleep, headaches, chills, fever or sweating, poor concentration and memory problems, depression, anxiety, hair loss, joint or muscle pain, irregular heartbeat, lung damage, scarring of the heart muscle, heart failure, kidney failure, and coughing. These can affect the victims for the rest of their lives. These victims have now been affected to the point of no return, where their bodies may never be the same again, and this could lower their quality and quantity of life. The effect on their bodies may completely alter their trajectories, maybe changing their individual lives for much, much worse. The pandemic, however, is the short-term consequence that occurs while the virus spreads and its effect on society. The affirmative team would have you focus on the negative aspects only of the pandemic rather than the ways it has improved society, because we have seen over the past, society always seems to bounce back from pandemics. Take the Black Plague of 1347 to 51, for example. After the Black Plague, societies changed radically for the better, bouncing back for a more fair and modern society. For example, in Europe, it resulted in an end to feudalism, increased wages, and innovation. The idea of separation from church and state, and attention to hygiene and medicine, which are only some of the positive things that came after the plague. It changed European society for the better. Well, to say it can't change ours. Throughout history, human societies have always bounced back, as after all, repeating what E. Buchaneri said, the vintage of history is forever repeating, same wines, same wines. Therefore, what's to say our society is not to be the same? Throughout the course of the pandemic, society has improved. We have improved the quality of personal and commercial hygiene, work-life balance, and the flexibility and realization of importance of family and human interconnection, to name a few. There was even a study by the University of Sydney where it was found that 70% of the participants said they had individually experienced one positive outcome, such as better mental health, and 54.2 reporting a more sufficient level of well-being. Therefore, it is abundantly clear that the long-term health risks of the COVID-19 virus.
I'll call upon the third affirmative speaker as you affirm.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic for tonight's debate is that the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is worse than the virus, and we, the affirmative team, strongly believe this statement to be true. So, the first member of the negative team has tried to tell you that the mental health decline caused all across the world, and especially in Australia, is due to the virus's existence, not just the pandemic. Well, even if the virus has affected mental health just because it is a virus, the inability to go anywhere or see anyone and connect with relatives who may be in serious danger has negatively impacted mental health throughout the last year and a half, and many people feel isolated and alone in this time. 73% in chance of suicide after job loss has also shown how alone and people feel, and that they can't be supported by anyone. Because if you can't go to your relatives and ask them for support, how are you supposed to ask them for money when they're probably also in this situation? The first affirmative speaker also compared COVID-19 to pneumonia, and whilst they sometimes show similar symptoms, they are not transmitted the same way or the same disease, and we have never seen a pandemic of pneumonia the same way that COVID is affecting the world. COVID-19 is contagious and it can be devastating, but it causes years of repercussions in the economy, which will affect us long after we have got the situation under control beyond the basic viral outbreaks. The second negative speaker has also tried to tell us that long-term health risks affect recovery. The long-term health risks and recovery will affect the economy, which is true, we agree with that. How will the economy recover from all of the long-term medical treatment that will need to be given to the millions of people affected by this virus, when we've already taken such a hit in the last year and a half, putting in emergency procedures that are barely holding together as they are? They have also tried to tell you that there needs to be a virus for something to be a pandemic. And whilst this is true, pandemics have effects on people, their mental health, and the economy that they live in, which causes a vicious cycle exacerbating itself again and again. Our second speaker, Harper, also never specifically said that all countries' GDP declined, simply that less developed countries are at further risk or further damaged because of what happens in the economy. So that's a straw man fallacy. The opposition have also brought up the effects of specific permanent injury, and that is true. People may be permanently injured from COVID-19, but like many other pandemics, people will come back from it but it will take years for the economy to recover from having to care for all of these new people suddenly with no warning. We have no support systems for this because nothing has been seen since the Spanish flu pandemic of the early 1900s. The long-term health risks have also talked about society recovering, and they said specifically society will recover, their bodies will not. And that is true, but as awful as it sounds, there will be more people. But if we have no economy to support them, then there won't be, and it will be terrible for everyone. There will be no economy, there will be no support system, and everything will become worse for the entire population. When we think of 2009, do we think of the flu pandemic that was affecting everyone? Yes, we don't think of the specific strand that it was or what the actual virus did. We think of the repercussions that it caused in today's society. Now I will be summing up our team case. Our first speaker, Jasmine, talked about improper monetary management during the pandemic and how it has put further strain on an already overloaded economic system and the effects of this on the disabled community. She also talked about how much the pandemic has affected mental health, with a massive increase in all of Australia alone in mental health systems, services, telehealth support systems, because we're not able to get the face-to-face connection that has been craved by millions of people. Lastly, she spoke about how Asian hate has skyrocketed in the midst of the pandemic, putting a lot of people in danger, causing more hospitalisation in something that has already increased the number of intensive care needed hugely. Our second speaker, Harper, told us about the historical economic trends during pandemics and the way job loss throughout COVID-19's pandemic will have a long-term impact on both the economy and the death toll of the pandemic itself. So, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen, we, the Affirmative team, truly believe that with all of the economic and human costs that have been incurred thus far during the still ongoing COVID-19 pandemic, and with all of its many variants, it is easily proven that the cost of the pandemic is far worse than the virus itself. Thank you.
I'll call upon the third negative speaker, Sasha Brennan.
Good evening, Madam Chairman, ladies and gentlemen. The topic of tonight's debate is that the cost of the COVID-19 pandemic is worse than the virus. We, the Negative team, strongly disagree with this statement. I will now rebut the Affirmative team's case. The first speaker from the Affirmative team has tried to tell you that the COVID pandemic is worse than the virus, as it has worsened the general mental health of the population. Although we do not dispute this generalised statement, we believe that the Affirmative team has painted an extremely negative picture of the pandemic's effects on mental well-being. The pandemic has no doubtedly highlighted the importance of mental health, an issue which has been somewhat looked over in the past. Now more than ever, people are checking on their friends and family and are more aware of these issues.
Furthermore, as a result of the pandemic, there are even more services available for people going through mental health issues. The government has provided over $20 million of additional funding to support research to improve mental health care and reduce suicide rates in Australia in wake of the pandemic. So although some people's mental health has decreased as a result of the pandemic, it is evident that there are some positive effects, including greater awareness and importance of mental health and increased government funding in this sector. The first speaker from the Affirmative team has tried to tell you that the COVID-19 pandemic is not worse than the virus, as the medical system has been grossly mismanaged. We, the Affirmative team, do acknowledge that there has been some understaffing and underfunding of the medical system, but we believe that this is not a cost of the pandemic itself, but the virus. The virus has caused the death of over 4.6 million people worldwide, and a further 200 million have been infected with it. Therefore, before the pandemic in 2019, hospitals were not strained. It is only the virus which has caused this strain on the system. The first Affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that the pandemic is worse than the virus, as it has disproportionately affected disabled people. We acknowledge the fact that there are many people in the community which are disadvantaged that have been affected disproportionately, but believe that the virus itself has been putting more people into hospitals and dying. Surely this can prove that the cost of the pandemic is not worse than the virus, as the virus has actually resulted in death, not just prejudice. We always have prejudice, but we do not always have these astounding levels of death in the community. The first speaker from the Affirmative team has tried to tell you that the cost of the COVID pandemic is worse than the virus, as it has resulted in an increased level in domestic violence. We do acknowledge that this unfortunately is true, but argue that this does not make it worse than the virus itself. In Australia, only 300 people die a year of domestic violence. Obviously, this is a large issue which should be focused on, but we believe that this does not outweigh the cost and the effects of the global pandemic, which has resulted in the deaths of 4.6 million people. The first Affirmative speaker has tried to tell you that the COVID-19 pandemic is not worse than the virus, as it has increased racism. We dispute this fact, as it is clearly not the result of the pandemic itself, but the virus. Racism aimed at Asians, and specifically Asian Americans, is a result of the actual virus and is no way related to society's response to the virus, as the racism fueled towards Asians is concerning the origins of the virus, not the world's response to the virus, but actually the virus itself. The second speaker from the Affirmative team has tried to make you believe that the cost of the COVID pandemic is worse than the virus, as it has resulted in large economic losses. Although there is some merit in this statement, it is largely misleading and an exaggeration. We, the negative team, do concede that for some people, such as casual hospitality workers, the pandemic has been detrimental from an economic standpoint, but disagree with the Affirmative team's point that the economy has been severely impacted. Here in Australia, we are prospering economically, despite being hit hard by the pandemic. According to the ABC, in June, Australia's economy had increased over 1.1% from pre-pandemic levels in aspects of GDP. There have also been similar GDP rises in Korea, Russia, China, and Chile. Moreover, the unemployment rate in Australia has actually decreased, despite what the Affirmative team will have you think. Our first speaker, Joy, has spoke to you about how the COVID-19 virus is extremely deadly. This virus has resulted in the death of over 4.5 million people worldwide, a figure which will no doubt continue to increase until high rates of vaccination are achieved. She also spoke about the scientific reasoning behind why COVID is so fatal. This virus attacks the human throat particles, which in many cases leads to acute respiratory distress syndrome. She also spoke regarding the immensely dangerous nature of COVID-19. This infectious disease has been mutating at a concerningly fast rate, with new variants such as the Delta strain being more contagious than the original virus. Our second speaker, Itika, spoke to you about the long-term serious health effects of COVID-19. As stated by the World Health Organization, some people experience long-term health symptoms which can be very detrimental. To conclude, I would like to reiterate that the cost of COVID-19 is in no way the pandemic is in no way worse than the actual virus, as it has killed 4.5 million people worldwide, has mutated rapidly, and there are significant long-term health effects associated with this disease. Thank you.
We now come to question time. For the next 3 minutes, teams are invited to take turns to ask each other questions about the debate. That is, the affirmative team will ask a question, then the negative team, then the affirmative, and so on. A team is free to indicate if it has no questions. I now invite the affirmative team to ask its first question.
Did you guys find your side of the argument, the negative side, difficult to argue, or?
We found that the topic was a bit confusing at the start because we were not sure about how you would define the topic, so we actually worked a lot on our definitions. So it's really hard because it depended on what you will say, and so yeah, it was kind of hard for our side as well. Yeah.
With the impact on the medical system, isn't that a direct result of the virus, not the cost of the pandemic? I was a bit unclear about that point.
Yeah, it is. It's because the virus is being overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, I think the main thing that we found difficult about the topic is that both sides are quite intermingled in that.
Yeah.
You could argue that they're very resultant from each other, and so it's quite hard to argue that one thing directly caused something without giving a point to the other side.
Yeah, I was researching 12 a.m. and I was is it chicken and the egg? The cost is bad. So yeah. It was Thank you. Do we have any more?
I think we had any other questions.
Do you guys have a question?
How did you find defining the topic? How did you?
Oh my god, we spent, we spent we did what you guys did. We were really prepared for a definition debate. We were they're gonna come for us. We were I don't know, we really went with cost in a figurative sense. And we were just hoping you guys wouldn't come for us for that. But it was such a difficult one to define, I agree.
And I think having it specifically be the COVID-19 pandemic made it very hard to find a definition that people agreed on, because there are different dates and different things that people count as COVID and then other disease outbreaks, so it's quite confusing trying to find an actual time.
Yeah, we tried also very hard to avoid a definition debate.
Yeah,
it was intense. Yeah, thank you.